Angels are supposed to be these friendly creatures that look like some type of a being wearing an astronaut suit. Replace the word angel with extraterrestrial, and we have a very different story. And in my opinion, that means that we were visited by some type of extraterrestrials. Good one, huh?
Shalom, shalom, my Habarim. Greetings, my YouTube Mishpaha. What's up, my people? And welcome, friends, to Bible on a Bicycle SUPERCUTS! My name is Will, and I'm an aspiring follower of Yeshua HaMashiach. You might know him as Jesus Christ. What is a SUPERCUTS fan edit, you might be asking yourself? Well, a SUPERCUTS is where we tackle a particular subject from within the pages of or surrounding the Bible, whether that be one of theology, doctrine, cultural context, or historicity. And first and foremost, we open up our Bibles to take it to the scriptures, reading the text for ourselves within context, whatever applicable. And then I go out so you don't have to, and I gather up the varying and oftentimes opposing opinions, viewpoints, teachings, and preachings from various theologians, scholars, philosophers, teachers, and preachers. You know, folks that are way more educated than this old guy and way better spoken than I. Then I gather that all up, haul it all together, and then I chop that all up. And through the magic of editing, I smush that all back together, hopefully into something that's comprehensive and cohesive. And then I serve right up to you in the form of a SUPERCUTS fan edit. And in this here particular little video, we're going to return to the strange and controversial subject of UFOs in the Bible. UFOs in the Bible? Yeah, there's folks out there that say there's actual UFOs in the Bible. Alien encounters, if you will. The most often quoted scriptures to back this up would be Ezekiel's wheel, those wheels within a wheel, and Elijah's burning chariot. But are these really UFOs, or is there a different explanation? And are these beings really aliens from another planet, or is there a different explanation for that one too? Well, to explore this subject, get a better grip on it, we're going to rely on two of my favorite teachers and preachers, starting with one of my favorite biblical scholars, the late great Dr. Michael S. Heiser, most well known for his works such as The Unseen Realm and Angels and Demons. And then flipping over to get a different point of view, we're going to listen to Chuck Missler, great teacher and preacher, passed away a number of years ago. But thankfully, thank God, we still have his works to refer to. And to top it all off, we're going to sprinkle in a little Carl Sagan, who also passed away a number of decades ago. I figure with this mix, we should be able to get a little better idea of what this whole commotion is about UFOs in the Bible. All right, without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to these gentlemen as we delve into the mysterious and controversial subject of UFOs in the Bible. All righty.
When you ask a question about flying saucers or UFOs in the Bible, you're really treading on something important that we like to call context. Now, anyone who's into Bible study or interpreting Scripture talks about context a lot. And we have to be careful here because the right way to think about the Bible is not to impose a modern context onto it. The result of that is you're making the biblical writers say things that they really didn't intend to say. The right context for interpreting the Bible is the context that produced the Bible, not a modern technological, scientific, or science fiction-y context. And that's going to become important as we talk about the whole question of whether certain passages in the Bible are talking about flying saucers.
So we're going to talk about today a Christian perspective of UFOs. Now, one of the things that's going to come up, and I wanted to lay the groundwork right up front, is the nature of reality as we understand it from modern science, and to take advantage of a message that we're in possession of that we can prove and demonstrate that is clearly of extraterrestrial origin. So fasten your seatbelts.
According to the Hebrew Bible, it was here, in the 6th century BC, that divine beings descended from heaven and made contact with a 30-year-old Hebrew priest named Ezekiel.
The go-to passage in the Bible to talk about UFOs is Ezekiel chapter 1. Now, this is the famous, bizarre vision that Ezekiel has in Babylon by the river Kavar, just after being taken captive by the Babylonians. And this is the one where we get the wheels within the wheels, and you get the bright fire and the luminescence and so on and so forth. And a lot of people look at this and think, wow, that must be a flying saucer. Again, we're imposing a modern context on Ezekiel 1.
One of the things that the secular researchers have concluded about the UFOs, it doesn't take any insight to realize that the whole UFO area is full of hoaxes, nonsense, and foolishness. But when you strip away the hoaxes on the one hand, and when you strip away the deliberate disinformation by some very well-resourced groups on the other hand, what you have left is disturbingly real. There are occasions where these UFOs are confirmed. They're tracked on radar, leave radiation behind. They're tangible on the one hand. And on the other hand, they behave in ways that totally defy our perception of physical laws. There are many people that presume that they are from some other galaxy or in some outer space context. However, those of you that have done serious research in this area know that the most competent researchers in this area, people like J. Allen Hynek, who passed away a few years ago, and Jacques Vallée and others, have come to the conclusion they're not from some other galaxy, they're from another dimension within our own. And so one of the things we want to talk about, that's strange talk, and we can glibly use cliches without really understanding what they mean, drawn either from science, mathematics, or even the Bible, and use them rather glibly. We want to cut through that a little bit and lay some foundation. So I want to talk a little bit about hyperspaces.
But what in fact was the mysterious object that touched down in front of Ezekiel and lifted him up to the sky? And who were the strange beings that emerged and shared a vision of the future with the prophet?
It might surprise people to realize that every element of this vision, every one, is known from Babylonian material. This is a very common description that we get in Ezekiel 1 of a very particular known thing. Now, we have a deity on a throne. The word throne is actually in the passage. Most UFOs that I think we would be familiar with from stories or movies don't have chairs sitting on top of them. We have luminescence for sure. We have a deity that's in human form. It's not a creature, not an alien, anything like that. We have wheels underneath. Again, UFOs, at least as we commonly think of them, being technologically advanced, don't need wheels, but here we have them in Ezekiel 1. And of course we have fire. People don't stop to think of something like, well, fire in a UFO, that means it has an internal combustion engine, which of course is impossible when you're talking about space travel.
Now, the trouble with hyperspace is there's only two kinds of people that seem to be able to reasonably deal with hyperspaces. Mathematicians that have special training, or small children. They have no problem with this sort of thing. Now let's back up and talk with Euclid. Euclid's writings are probably the most widely circulated and popular for the last 2,000 years, second only to the Bible. And I'd like to just talk a little bit about trigonometry. Let me ask you a question. How many of you know how many degrees are there in a triangle? If I take a triangle, typically say a 30, 60, 90 triangle, and add up the degrees, it adds up to what? 180 degrees, exactly. If I take a 45, 45, 90 as another example, again, the angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. That's how many knew that? Okay, good. Well, suppose Dr. Eastman and I walked out into the large desert area out here and laid out a very large triangle. And as we compared our calculations, we discovered that our angles added up to more than 180 degrees. What would you conclude? That we screwed up again. What you'd expect from Chuck and Mark, right? No, if we have a triangle that adds up to more than 180 degrees, and we check our figures, it's accurate, what have we encountered? The curvature of the earth, exactly right. In other words, a third dimension. See, these little rules that we learned in school have to do with plane geometry, a geometry of only two dimensions. If you take a course in navigation, you encounter spherical trigonometry where you can have a triangle with 90 degrees in each corner. And again, this is a way that we encounter an additional dimension. A three-dimensional triangle obviously can have degree. In fact, that's how you know it's three-dimensional, if it violates that original geometry. Now, that's the kind of insight that led to Dr. Einstein's solutions as he grappled with the nature of our reality. Most of you know that in 1905, he had a special theory of relativity in which length, mass, and velocity and time are relative to the velocity of the observers, the famous initial step at this. And it was a few years later that he generalized this theory, and he discovered that there really is no distinction between time and space. If you're really properly briefed, you will always speak of space-time. We don't do that. We're comfortable with three spatial dimensions and time. We treat them separately.
In the Bible, the prophet Ezekiel calls these spiritual beings cherubims and describes them as having 4 faces, 4 wings, and skin that shone like polished bronze.
Now, in the vision, we have discussion of cherubim. And we do have cherubim with 4 faces. They are sitting facing outward underneath a round platform on top of which is a throne. On top of that is a very human-looking deity that Ezekiel calls the glory of God, or the glory. And in chapter 10, where we get the same vision, it's the God of Israel in human form. And we know what that looks like because of lots of other passages in the Bible. But what about the cherubim? What about the whole setup, the wheels and the platform and the throne? Again, all of these things are known from Mesopotamian iconography and sculpture. It's not a coincidence, for example, that the 4 faces of the cherubim in Ezekiel 1 are the 4 cardinal points of the Babylonian zodiac. And there's a throne, a deity, on top of them. The messaging is actually pretty clear, that the deity enthroned above this platform, it's a stock description of where a deity or a human king would sit. Cherubim were throne guardians, but in this case the faces are really important because the idea is that the deity is in control of the 4 corners of the earth. And because they're situated in the zodiac for the Babylonians, and that's where Ezekiel's at. He's in Babylon, and so people are going to be familiar with the imagery. The idea being conveyed is that the zodiac, as it cycles through time, as it cycles through the sky, and tracks time, tracks the passage of history, the events of humanity, who's in control of time? Who's in control of these cycles of life? Who is in control of human history? Well, it's the enthroned deity. And guess who's on the throne? It's not the Babylonian god Marduk. It's the God of Israel. And the message to the captives in Babylon is significant. You're here in Babylon. You're the people of God, and you're wondering, how in the world did you ever get here? Why were you kicked out of the land? Why is this happening to you? Did Marduk just defeat your God? And the answer is no. The God of Israel is still the one in control. He is still in control of human history. You will not be here forever. He is in charge. He is still on the throne. That's the message of Ezekiel 1, not a flying saucer with internal combustion engines from somewhere else in the solar system.
But we know in modern science that we live in at least a 4-dimensional continuum. And by the way, this has been confirmed 12 different ways to 5 decimal places and beyond. In fact, I understand recently an experiment confirmed it to 14 decimal places. So the point is, they're really, while we call it the theory of relativity, it's far more than a theory, it's well confirmed. Now, this leads us then into the whole area of hyperspaces. You and I would tend to be most comfortable at visualizing this as 3 spatial dimensions, length, width, and height, and time. But time itself is a physical property. And in particle physics today, if you're currently reading particle physics, you know that they have concluded that we actually live in 10 dimensions. And it's interesting that that was perceived by the ancient Hebrew writers from Genesis chapter 1. But rather than do our homework in Genesis 1, we've spent billions of dollars on accelerators to determine it the hard way. But in any case, now the reason we're getting into this today is I think it's going to be useful for at least to consider the possibility that these UFOs, and more importantly, their occupants and whatever, are coming to us not from some far galaxy, although they seem to be posing as if they are, but they come from another dimension, and that has profound implications for you and I.
The other passage that people often think about when they talk about UFOs in the Bible, or at least try to justify that idea, is the story of Elijah being taken to heaven and the chariot of fire. Believe it or not, Elijah is never actually said to get in the chariot. The chariot is never actually said to take Elijah anywhere. If you actually look at the passage again closely, and we have, again, contextual issues here that we really need to think about, you see the description, yeah, there's a chariot of fire. There are also horses of fire. Now, I would suggest that the biblical writer knew what horses were, and it's sort of not, normative to have horses of fire. He calls them horses of fire. So he can make out the outline of a horse at the very least. And so that alone should sort of disqualify the passage from anything that we would normally think of as a flying saucer. You also have to notice the fire. So here we'd have another case of an internal combustion engine capable of space travel. Again, we know these things are not scientifically coherent, and they're also not textually coherent. Again, horses of fire are not going to be a substitute for something else. The biblical writer knows what a horse looks like, and that's the terminology that's used.
Now, we have trouble going up in dimensions. If I start talking 4 or 5 dimensions, you and I will be at a loss because we're not specially trained in that way. But we can gain some insights by imagining something less than 3 and drawing some inferences. Let's imagine a world that has only 2 dimensions, like a plane.
Let's imagine that we are perfectly flat. I mean absolutely flat. And that we live, appropriately enough, in a flatland. A land designed and named by Edwin Abbott, a Shakespearean scholar who lived in Victorian England. Everybody in flatland is, of course, exceptionally flat. We have squares, circles, triangles, and we all scurry about, and we can go into our houses and do our flat business. Now, we have width and length, but no height at all. Now, these little cutouts have some little height, but let's ignore that. Let's imagine that these are absolutely flat. That being the case, we know, us flatlanders, about left-right, and we know about forward-back, but we have never heard of up-down. Let us imagine that into flatland, hovering above it, comes a strange 3-dimensional creature which, oddly enough, looks like an apple. And the 3-dimensional creature sees an attractive, congenial-looking square, watches it enter its house, and decides in a gesture of interdimensional amity to say hello. Hello, says the 3-dimensional creature. How are you? I am a visitor from the 3rd dimension. Well, the poor square looks around his closed house, sees no one there, and what's more, has witnessed a greeting coming from his insides, a voice from within. He surely is getting a little worried about his sanity. The 3-dimensional creature is unhappy about being considered a psychological aberration, and so he descends to actually enter flatland. Now, a three-dimensional creature exists in flatland only partially. Only a plane, a cross-section through him can be seen. So when the three-dimensional creature first reaches flatland, it's only the points of contact which can be seen, and we'll represent that by stamping the apple in this ink pad and placing that image in flatland. And as the apple were to descend through, slither by flatland, we would progressively see higher and higher slices, which we can represent by cutting the apple. So the square, as time goes on, sees a set of objects mysteriously appear from nowhere and inside a closed room and change their shape dramatically.
These UFOs may be windows into another dimension more so than objects. And you and I have a tough time relating to that, but he may be very, very correct.
We need to be a little more careful and take a look at the passage more closely. The thing that Elijah is taken up into or taken up by to heaven is a whirlwind. This is a stock description in the Old Testament for God or God's presence. Again, God doesn't need a spaceship. We don't have a spaceship here. But kings and deities were said to travel about in chariots. And when it came to a deity, it would be a fiery chariot or a heavenly chariot. This is what's being described. And so Elijah has a vision of a chariot that belongs to God in this case. And it's fiery because fire was associated with divine presence, the glory, just like we saw in Ezekiel 1. But he can make out the outlines of a chariot and horses and so on and so forth. So we know that God is there in the scene somewhere, but Elijah never gets into the thing and it never takes him anywhere. He is taken up in a whirlwind. This is 2 Kings 2, 9 through 12. If you just read it, you will see that these details do not conform, again, to something you'd expect for a flying saucer. And of course, the argument always is, well, maybe, they're seeing something that they can't decipher. But did you just track with what I was saying? They're looking at something. Elijah is seeing something that he can decipher. He can process it. They knew what chariots and horses and fire looked like. They have the vocabulary for other things like silver and disc and round and windows. Again, the things you'd associate today with a flying saucer. But that's not what is described in this passage.
Let's assume that we were trying to communicate a three-dimensional object to a two-dimensional world. We would be asking that two-dimensional world to encounter things that they don't encounter in their experience. Our imaginations are generally limited to our own experiences. One way we could try to do it if we had a cube would be to project that three-dimensional image into a two-dimensional space and maybe rotate it, but its behavior in the two-dimensional space would be bizarre.
What about the fourth dimension? Now, to approach that, let's consider a cube. We can imagine a cube in the following way. You take a line segment and move it at right angles to itself an equal length. That makes a square. Move that square an equal length at right angles to itself, and you have a cube. Now, this cube, we understand, casts a shadow. And that shadow we recognize. It's, ordinarily drawn in third grade classrooms as two squares with their vertices connected. Now, if we look at the shadow of a three-dimensional object in two dimensions, we see that, in this case, not all the lines appear equal. Not all the angles are right angles. The three-dimensional object has not been perfectly represented in its projection in two dimensions, but that's part of the cost of losing a dimension in the projection.
Another way we could do that would be to take a three-dimensional cube, say, and unravel it into two dimensions. And we would take that two-dimensional cube and start to unfold it and lay it out flat. And that would be a way, possibly, to try to get a two-dimensional being that we're communicating with to recognize what a three-dimensional cube might be.
Now, let's take this three-dimensional cube and project it, carry it through a fourth physical dimension. Not that way, not that way, not that way, but at right angles to those three directions. I can't show you what direction that is, but imagine that there is a fourth physical dimension.
But all of these are very imperfect because we're asking that two-dimensional being in a two-dimensional world to extend their concepts into a dimension, into a region that they have no experience with. Now let's take another example, and that is there are such things as hypercubes, a four-dimensional cube.
In that case, we would generate a four-dimensional hypercube, which is also called a tesseract. I cannot show you a tesseract because I and you are trapped in three dimensions. But what I can show you is the shadow in three dimensions of a four-dimensional hypercube or tesseract. This is it. And you can see it's two nested cubes, all the vertices connected by lines. And now the real tesseract in four dimensions would have all the lines of equal length and all the angles right angles. That's not what we see here, but that's the penalty of projection. So you see, while we cannot imagine the world of four dimensions, we can certainly think about it perfectly well.
How do I represent a hypercube in the three dimensions? One way is to unravel it, and one suggestion is what's called a Hinton cube, which is an unraveled Hinton cube or a hypercube called a tesseract. And even you and I look at that and have a tough time trying to relate to a four-dimensional cube. You say, well, what practical use? Interestingly enough, Salvador Dali used that tesseract, a four-dimensional cube, in his famous painting of the crucifixion. What we've done here in just a little tent of exploration is go beyond Euclid, and we like to talk about more than three dimensions, hyperspaces. It turns out the most important lecture ever given in history, the history of mathematics, occurred in June of 1854, when George Riemann, who was a pastor's son, by the way, developed a set of mathematics, metric tensors, that opened our thinking to be able to represent meaningfully hyperspaces, spaces of more than three dimensions. And that it took about 60 years later that Einstein, exploiting those concepts, developed his four-dimensional space-time. Now, the irony of Einstein's life is he went to his death frustrated by not being able to relate gravity and light into that region.
His only conclusion could be that he's gone bonkers. Well, the apple might be a little annoyed at this conclusion, and so not such a friendly gesture from dimension to dimension, makes a contact with the square from below and sends our flat creature fluttering and spinning above flatland. At first, the square has no idea what's happening. He's terribly confused. This is utterly outside his experience. But after a while, he comes to realize that he is seeing inside closed rooms in flatland. He is looking inside his fellow flat creatures. He is seeing flatland from a perspective no one has ever seen it before to his knowledge. Getting into another dimension provides as an incidental benefit a kind of X-ray vision. Now our flat creature slowly descends to the surface, and his friends rush up to see him. From their point of view, he has mysteriously appeared from nowhere. He hasn't walked from somewhere else. He's come from some other place. They say, for heaven's sake, what's happened to you? And the poor square has to say, well, I was in some other mystic dimension called up. And they will pat him on his side and comfort him, or else they'll ask, well, show us, where is that third dimension? Point to it. And the poor square will be unable to comply.
And it was actually in 1953 that Kaluza and Klein together developed by extending another dimension. Light is basically a vibration in 5 dimensions. Light and supergravity have been integrated by the Kaluza-Klein models, which are basically extending this 4-dimensional space into more than 4, 5, 6, and so forth. And in 1963, the Yang-Mills fields, extending it even further, have integrated electromagnetic and both the nuclear forces, both the strong and the weak nuclear forces, for those of you that are familiar with physics. There are 4 basic forces in the universe, and 3 of the 4 have been integrated by the techniques. Now, the current thinking from about 1984 on is that the universe actually consists of what the mathematicians called superstrings, and that they actually involve 10-dimensional mathematics.
Now, imagine a universe just like Flatland, truly two-dimensional, and entirely flat in every direction, but with one exception. Unbeknownst to the inhabitants, their two-dimensional universe is curved into a third physical dimension, maybe into a sphere, but at any rate, into something entirely outside their experience. Locally, their universe still looks flat enough, but if one of them, much smaller and flatter than me, takes a very long walk along what seems to be a straight line, he would uncover a great mystery. Suppose he marked his starting point here and set off to explore his universe. He never turns around and he never reaches an edge. He doesn't know that his apparently flat universe is actually curved into an enormous sphere. He doesn't sense that he's walking around a globe. Why should his space be curved? Because there's so much matter in this universe that it gravitationally warps space, closing it back on itself into a sphere. But our Flatlander doesn't know this. After a long while, he'll find he somehow returns to his starting point. There must be a third dimension. Our Flatlander couldn't imagine a third dimension, but he could sure deduce it. Now, increase all the dimensions in this story by 1, and you have something like the situation which many cosmologists think may actually apply to us. We are 3-dimensional creatures trapped in 3 dimensions. We imagine our universe to be flat in 3 dimensions, but maybe it's curved into a 4th. We can talk about a 4th physical dimension, but we can't experience it. No one can point to the 4th dimension. I mean, there's left, right, and there's forward, back, there's up, down, and there's some other directions simultaneously at right angles to those familiar 3 dimensions.
Now, it's not our purpose here to get into this area, because there's 2 kinds of people in the audience, those that are familiar with this, and those that already have learned more than they really want to know about hyperspaces. But I want to mention this because there seems to be good evidence from the reports that these encounters that are going on involve hyperspaces. These UFOs and their occupants not only are clocked on radar and elsewhere at making right-angle turns at speeds that are incredible, which imply they're massless by our physics. They also go faster than the speed of sound without sonic booms, and that's a disturbing thing. But what's most disturbing is they seem to have the ability to materialize and dematerialize at will. And that disturbs us. It makes them seem very, what we would use the term supernatural. But that supernatural term may derive only because of our limited understanding of nature.
And this is the way it goes. With the discussion of UFOs in the Bible, we always seem to end up with a situation where people will be imposing things from the science fiction world or something they saw on History Channel or some other television program, or again, what we typically conceive of as a flying saucer, and they will impose it onto the biblical text and then justify doing so in some way.
Ooh-wee, what do you think about that? That's a lot of information to be cramming in the old cranium, wasn't it? Hopefully you had your Bibles out and following along as you joined us here today discussing this controversial subject. What do you got to say about all of this? What do you think about this whole UFOs in the Bible? Do you think that we've been contacted by some types of extraterrestrial beings? I mean, if you think about it, the Bible is chock full of extraterrestrials, that being beings that weren't born on planet. I mean, Yahweh, the divine council, all the angels, seraphim, None of those were born here on Earth, so I guess technically they'd be ETs. But are they interplanetary little green men out there? Or are they more of a interdimensional or spiritual apparition from the unseen realm? I'd be interested to know what you got to say about this here topic in the little comments down below. While you're down there, if you're not already, when I hit that little subscribe button, give us some love with a thumbs up down there. And make sure you hit that little share button. Share this here video with any friends or family members you think might benefit from or enjoy watching this video. A big shout out to all you subscribers, both new and returning. And a huge thank you to everyone who continues to support this here little channel and the ministry we do here locally, reaching out to the homeless and those experiencing poverty in our local area. If you'd be interested in something like that, there's some Amazon links down below. You can do a one-time donation at the PayPal, support us over on the Ko-Fi, or if you're here on the YouTubes, become a member down below. And if you're not able to help support this channel or the ministry we do here financially, don't worry about it. I'm just glad you joined us here today and hopefully opened up your Bibles, found out a little something new as we explored the more mysterious and unusual subjects concerning our Holy Bible. I hope to see you here again next time. And until next time, remember, Yeshua, Jesus loves you. And so do I. Now get off of here, go ride your bike, and read your Bible.